The wind carried no mercy that day, only the sound of a woman cast aside. She had been sold off as useless for being barren, her worth measured in whispers and shame. Yet out on the frontier, where a widowed rancher struggled to raise his children alone, her fate took a turn no one expected. What began in rejection soon became the story of how a broken woman found a family, and how children once motherless would come to call her mama. The night broke with a sound too heavy to be silence. The small town on the edge of the Montana frontier stirred awake in uneasy whispers, its main street already alive with the crunch of boots and the creak of wagons. Dust swirled in pale, morning light as men in rough coats and women in aprons drifted toward the square, drawn as always to the spectacle of another soul cast out. At the center of it all stood Eliza Warren. Her head was lowered, brown hair tangled and half covering her face. The coarse rope at her wrists wasn't necessary. She wasn't fighting. She hadn't fought for months, not since her own kin had called her barren, useless, a burden no man should keep. Her father's voice still rang in her memory, hard as iron. What good is a woman who cannot give a son? The auction block was meant for cattle and tools, but that morning they'd shoved her there instead. She stood with bare hands and a hollowed heart while men muttered, their eyes shifting between pity and disdain. A woman too thin, too quiet, too shamed. No dowry, no womb worth counting. Sheriff Harlan McCade kept his jaw tight as he presided. He wasn't cruel, but order was his creed, and order meant that even those unwanted had to be settled. She'll work, cook, clean, keep house, he announced, his voice clipped. Price to be named. The silence that followed cut deeper than laughter. No one wanted her. Eliza felt her cheeks burn, and she prayed only that it would end quickly, that she might vanish into the ground beneath her. And then, boots on wood. A tall figure stepped from the crowd, his hat shadowing his face, his presence carrying the quiet weight of a man long familiar with loss. Jacob Hartley, widowed rancher, father of 3. He was not a man who often lingered in town, preferring the back-breaking work of his ranch and the solitude it brought since his wife's passing 2 winters before. "I'll take her," Jacob said simply, his voice steady as the land. The murmurs erupted at once. "Hartley, what's he want with her?" "Man's desperate, surely. Children'll never stomach that." Eliza's head snapped up, disbelief in her wide eyes. She knew of Hartley, of course. Everyone did. A man carrying both land and grief, trying to raise his little ones without a mother. Yet why he would tie himself to her, broken and shamed, she couldn't fathom. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure, Hartley? She's not—" "I'm sure," Jacob cut in. He didn't look at the sheriff. His gaze was steady on Eliza. Not soft, not cruel, but direct, as though he was measuring more than her shame, searching for something deeper. The deal was struck with no more fuss, and just like that, Eliza's life changed. She climbed into the back of Jacob's wagon, wrists freed, though the marks of the rope seemed to linger still. The children, 2 boys and a girl, sat stiffly on the bench, their eyes wide and uncertain. The eldest, Thomas, narrowed his gaze, at her like a young hawk, while little Clara clutched a rag doll to her chest. The road out of town was long and silent, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady plod of horses. Jacob drove with his shoulders squared, his profile etched against the horizon. Eliza sat among the supplies, her hands clasped, her heart pounding with the weight of shame and a flicker of something else. Fear, yes, but perhaps also a thin thread of relief. For the first time since her family's rejection, she wasn't entirely alone. The ranch came into view as dusk painted the sky. Acres of rough grassland, fences needing mending, a barn leaning just slightly with age. Smoke rose from the chimney of the house, modest but sturdy. It was no grand homestead, but it breathed of work and life. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of stew. Jacob's late wife's touches lingered: embroidered curtains, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves lined with jars of preserves. Eliza's throat tightened. She was stepping into another woman's shadow, into a space where love once lived. Jacob broke the silence at last. "You'll have your own room. The children need tending. House, too. I won't ask more than that." Eliza nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Her voice cracked, unused to being heard. "Not, sir," Jacob said after a pause, setting his hat on the peg. "Just Hartley. Or Jacob, if you prefer." The children exchanged glances, whispering between themselves, still studying her as though she were some wild creature let into their home. That night, when the lamps dimmed and the house quieted, Eliza sat on the edge of her small bed. The day's events washed over her in waves: the auction block, the eyes of strangers, the moment Jacob had spoken. She pressed her palms to her face, tears spilling, silent but sharp. Yet as she listened, a faint sound drifted down the hall. A child's cough, ragged and stubborn, breaking the stillness. She froze, listening again. Another cough, harsher this time. Her heart quickened. Without thinking, she rose, her bare feet silent against the wood. She followed the sound to a small room where the youngest boy, Samuel, tossed beneath his quilt, fevered and struggling for breath. Eliza's instincts surged. She knelt by the bed, brushing damp hair from his brow. The boy whimpered, too weak to push her away. She fetched a rag and a basin, dampening the cloth, laying it against his hot skin. Through the long hours of the night, she stayed, and for the first time, she was needed. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. The first light of dawn spilled across the plains, catching the frost on the fences and the weary lines of Jacob Hartley's face as he stepped onto the porch. He paused to draw in the cold air, listening for the sounds of his children within the house. What he heard instead was the soft murmur of a woman's voice. Inside, Eliza Warren still sat by Samuel's bed, eyes ringed with fatigue, the damp cloth in her hand worn thin from hours of tending. The boy's fever had broken some time before dawn. His breathing was steadier now, his small chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm. She hadn't slept at all, not daring to leave his side. Jacob lingered at the doorway, arms folded. For a moment he said nothing, watching as she brushed Samuel's hair back with surprising tenderness. Then he cleared his throat. "You've been up all night?" Eliza startled, rising quickly as though she'd been caught in some offense. "He was burning up. I couldn't leave him." Jacob stepped closer, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He knelt, checking the boy's brow for himself. Samuel stirred, murmuring incoherently, then drifted back into sleep. Jacob gave a slow nod. "Looks better than he did last night." Eliza clasped her hands, unsure of whether to speak. She feared reproach, some reminder of her place. Yet Jacob only straightened and said, "Thank you." His tone was simple, but the words struck her harder than she expected. When was the last time anyone had thanked her? The children hovered in the doorway, Thomas glaring, Clara wide-eyed, clutching her doll. They said nothing, only studied her like a stranger wearing a mask. The day's work began soon after. Jacob left for the barn, and Eliza set about the kitchen. She knew how to knead bread, how to keep stew simmering, how to scrub floors until they shone. Her own mother had taught her those things before the bitterness set in, before the accusations about her womb. Clara trailed after her as she worked, silent at first, then daring a question. "Why'd you sit with Sammy all night?" Eliza paused at the hearth. "Because he needed someone." Clara frowned, hugging her doll. "Mama used to sit like that." The words were a knife wrapped in innocence. Eliza lowered her eyes. "I'm not your mama, but I'll do my best to help." Clara studied her a moment longer, then slipped away, leaving Eliza's heart tight. By midday, Jacob returned from the fields, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold air. He found the house in order, the smell of fresh bread drifting through. The table was set, bowls laid neatly. Clara perched on her chair with Samuel wrapped in a quilt nearby. The meal passed with more silence than words. Thomas, the eldest, scowled at his food, his suspicion sharp as any blade. Finally, he spoke. "We don't need her." The words stung, but Jacob's gaze flicked sharply toward his son. "Mind your manners." "She's not Mama," Thomas pressed, his jaw tight. "She doesn't belong here." Eliza lowered her head, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. Jacob's voice, firm and measured, cut through. "She's here now, and she kept your brother breathing last night." "That counts for something." The boy quieted, though resentment still simmered in his eyes. Eliza busied herself clearing dishes, hiding the tears that threatened. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm. She mended torn shirts, patched quilts, chopped wood kindling, and milked the cow. Each task anchored her, though the children's watchful eyes weighed heavily. Thomas remained cold, Clara curious, Samuel too weak yet to form an opinion. One evening, as Jacob returned from the barn, he found Eliza struggling with the wash. The icy water bit at her hands, but she scrubbed on. He watched a long moment before stepping in. "Don't have to prove yourself all at once," he said quietly. Eliza looked up, startled. I just don't want to be a burden." Jacob's eyes softened, though his voice stayed steady. "You're not. Burdens don't keep sick boys alive. Burdens don't have this house cleaner than it has been in a year." She blinked at him, the words soaking deeper than he knew. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, something dangerously close to hope. That night, when the children were in bed, Eliza sat by the fire, her sewing in her lap. Jacob joined her, the rocking chair creaking under, his weight. Silence stretched between them, comfortable this time. "You didn't have to take me in," she said at last, her voice soft. "No," Jacob agreed, "but I reckon I saw someone who deserved more than the way they were being treated." He met her eyes, steady as ever. "And my children needed someone." Eliza lowered her gaze, the firelight warming her cheeks. She dared not read more into his words, but the truth was plain. He had saved her, though she did not yet understand why. Later, as she slipped into her small room, she heard it again, a cough from Samuel, faint but no longer fevered. And then, Clara's whisper carried down the hall, soft as a secret. She sat up with him all night, just like Mama. The words wrapped around Eliza's heart, fragile but powerful. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was not entirely useless. The town spoke louder than any gun ever fired. News traveled faster than the river's current in a place like Dry Creek. By the time a week had passed, every porch and parlor seemed to buzz with the same talk. Jacob Hartley had brought home the Barren woman. At the mercantile, whispers swirled between shelves of flour and bolts of calico. Heard she was sold off by her own kin. Can't give him any more children? What use is she? Poor man's gone soft since his wife died. Eliza felt their eyes like needles when she came into town with Clara by her side, the little girl clutching her hand. She kept her chin tucked low, wishing herself invisible. But no one in Dry Creek was ever invisible. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Tillman, gave a thin smile edged in pity. "Children do need a woman's hand, Jacob," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "But some hands, well, they ain't meant to build a family." Eliza's cheeks flamed, but Jacob's steady voice cut through. "Her hands are good enough for mine." He paid for the supplies without another word and guided Eliza and Clara out the door, leaving silence behind him. Back at the ranch, the children carried the weight of gossip too. Thomas came home from town, scowling, his fists clenched. "Boys say she ain't no real woman. Said Pa's a fool." Jacob's jaw worked, but before he could answer, Eliza knelt before the boy. "Thomas," she said softly, "sometimes people talk because they're afraid of what they don't understand. But you don't have to carry their words inside you." The boy pulled away, his eyes blazing. "You're not my mama. Don't pretend you are." The words cut deep, but Eliza only nodded, swallowing the ache. "You're right, I'm not. But I care about you all the same." Thomas stormed off, leaving Jacob watching with something unreadable in his gaze. Days passed, the tension thickening like a storm waiting to break. Eliza worked harder, pouring herself into the ranch, hauling water, stitching torn saddles, tending Samuel until his cheeks flushed healthy again. She didn't speak of the gossip, though she heard it echo in her mind at night. One evening, Jacob returned from town with news. "Sheriff stopped me," he said, unbuckling his gun belt. "Asked why I'd gone and tied myself to you. Said men were wondering if I'd lost my senses." Eliza froze by the hearth. "And what did you tell him?" Jacob's eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Told him I didn't need to explain myself to any man. What happens under this roof is between us, not them." Her throat tightened. She had expected indifference at best, shame at worst. But this defense spoken so, simply, was something she had not known in years. Still, the town's scorn pressed closer. At Sunday service, the pew behind them rustled with whispers. Eliza sat stiff, Clara nestled against her side, while Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Afterward, Mrs. Tillman again approached, voice dripping false sweetness. "Jacob, you know we all mean well, but children need a proper mother, not—" Her eyes flicked toward Eliza. "Damaged goods." Jacob's expression darkened, his voice like iron. "Say what you will, Mrs. Tillman, but my children have food, warmth, and someone who sat up through the night when their brother was sick. That's more than gossip ever gave." The woman's mouth snapped shut, and for once, silence followed. That night, as the wind howled against the shutters, Eliza sat by the fire, her hands trembling over her sewing. "Why do you do it?" she whispered. Jacob looked up from his whittling. "Do what?" "Defend me. Stand against them. You don't owe me anything." His knife paused mid-stroke. "Don't I? You work harder than most. You care for children who aren't your own. You shoulder shame that was never yours to bear. If that doesn't earn defending, I don't know what does." Her breath caught, eyes stinging. For years, she had been told she was worth nothing. Now this man, plain-spoken and unbending, looked at her as though she were something rare. But shadows lingered. That same week, a rider from her past appeared. In town, her brother-in-law, Daniel Warren. His eyes were cold, his mouth cruel. Word spread quickly. He'd come to collect debts, and he carried with him the old venom of her rejection. Eliza learned of his presence when Clara burst into the kitchen breathless. "A man in town asked about you, said your name, said you didn't belong here." Her heart froze. The life she was beginning to piece together felt suddenly fragile, like glass in a storm. That evening, Jacob found her on the porch, staring out at the fading light. "He's here," she murmured, voice low. "Daniel. He'll drag me back if he can." Jacob's hand tightened on the railing. "He won't. Not while I draw breath." His words were steady, but the weight behind them was fierce. Eliza turned. Meeting his gaze, and for the first time since her exile, she believed she might not have to fight alone. Still, the storm was only beginning. The storm did not break with thunder, but with a man's voice in the street. Dry Creek's main road was restless that afternoon, wagons groaning under sacks of grain, horses stamping against the dust. And at the center of it stood Daniel Warren, Eliza's brother-in-law, broad-shouldered, mean-eyed, carrying the swagger of a man certain the world owed him something. His words carried far, meant to draw a crowd. That Barren sister-in-law of mine's been hiding here, playing house with Hartley. His laugh was sharp, cutting. Family cast her off for good reason. Useless woman. Ain't fit for any man's home. The words lashed Eliza like a whip, though she was not there to hear them firsthand. It was Clara who carried them back, her small face pale as she whispered what she'd overheard. He said you don't belong here. He said Papa made a mistake. Jacob's jaw set hard when the child repeated it. He didn't waste words, just pulled on his coat, took his hat from the peg, and stepped out into the gathering dusk. Eliza followed, her breath ragged. "Jacob, please!" He turned, eyes burning steady. "He'll not shame you again. Not while I stand." The town gathered fast as Jacob strode into the street, boots striking the ground with finality. Daniel grinned when he saw him, spitting into the dust. "Hartley, you're a fool, taking in what no man wanted." Jacob's voice carried calm steel. "Careful, Warren. You speak that way again and you'll answer for it." Daniel sneered, drawing closer. "She's no wife, no mother, just a mouth to feed. Send her back where she belongs." The crowd leaned in, whispers sharp as knives. Eliza, trembling at the edge, felt every gaze upon her. Shame rose like bile, old, familiar. But Jacob's words cut through it like a blade through rope. "She belongs where she's needed," he said, loud enough for all to hear. His eyes swept the crowd, then fixed on Daniel. "And she is needed in my home. My children eat because of her. They laugh again because of her. You call that useless?" Silence. Even the horses seemed to be still. Daniel bristled, fists balling, but Jacob didn't flinch. "You'll not take her. You'll not drag her name through the mud in front of these people again. If you do, it won't be words we settle with." The sheriff stepped forward, tension thick in his stance. "Enough, both of you. Dry Creek's had enough fighting for one lifetime." His eyes cut to Daniel. "You've said your piece. Time you move on." Daniel spat again, but under Jacob's steady gaze and the sheriff's warning, he turned, with a curse, and stalked off. The crowd slowly thinned, murmurs following in the wake. Eliza stood frozen, her chest heaving, eyes burning with unshed tears. Jacob approached, his face softened now that the danger had passed. "You didn't have to," she began, but her voice broke. "Yes," he said firmly. "I did." That night, when the house was quiet and the children tucked safe in their beds, Eliza lingered by the fire, the crackle filling the silence between them. Finally, she spoke. "There's more you don't know." Jacob looked up from the chair, his carving knife still in hand. "Then tell me," her hands twisted in her lap. "It wasn't just that I couldn't bear children. It was the way they treated me for it. Day after day, whispers in my own home. His family, Daniel, his wife, they called me cursed, said I was a weight dragging everyone down. When my husband died, they cast me out. No bed, no roof, no kin willing to claim me." Her voice shook, the memories raw. "I wandered for weeks before the sheriff found me. He thought the auction was mercy, said at least I might find work. But work turned into shame." The firelight caught the sheen of tears in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see a home again. Never thought anyone would look at me as less than a woman." Jacob's knife stilled. His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Eliza, listen to me." His voice was low, deliberate. "You've done more for my family in a handful of weeks than most could in years. You tended my boy when the fever nearly took him. You put steadiness back in this house. My children have hope because of you." She shook her head, unable to believe it, but he leaned forward, his tone fierce. "You are not useless, not cursed. You are needed. Here. By them. By me." Her breath caught, the words hitting deeper than any kindness she'd known. For the first time, the weight of her shame began to loosen. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, something shifted, quiet, fragile, and unspoken. A bond forming, not from blood or expectation, but from choice. Later, as she lay in her narrow bed, Eliza closed her eyes and heard again the echo of Jacob's voice before the crowd. She belongs where she's needed. For the first time in years, she let herself believe it might be true. But shadows do not vanish so easily, and Daniel Warren's threats would not end with words. The wind carried trouble long before the rider came into sight. A week passed after the standoff in town, but the tension never left Dry Creek. The townsfolk still whispered, their voices hushed but sharp, as though waiting for something to crack. And then, as dusk fell one evening, a lone rider appeared at the Hartley Ranch. Daniel Warren sat tall in the saddle, his eyes hard, his smirk cruel. Behind him trailed two men whose faces bore the lean look of hired fists. Their presence told the story plain. Daniel had not come only to talk. Jacob stepped from the barn, his hand resting on the handle of his axe. Eliza froze at the doorway, the children clinging to her skirts as the horses stamped and blew. Daniel's voice carried across the yard. "Hartley, you've got something that belongs to me. My kin's name, my brother's widow. You've no right keeping her." Jacob's stance didn't shift. "She's no property of yours," Daniel spat into the dirt. "Law might see it differently. A widow has no right to choose where she lays her head. Her bloodline's barren, her debt unpaid. I say she comes back with me." The words hit Eliza like stones, dragging her back to the days when every breath was shame. She clutched Clara's hand tighter, fighting the tremor in her knees. Jacob's voice was iron. "You'll not take her. Not today, not ever. Step off my land." Daniel laughed, sharp and bitter. "You think this patch of dirt makes you king? I'll take this to the courts. Sheriff's ear bends my way more than yours. You'll lose her, Hartley, and when you do, she'll crawl back where she belongs." The threat hung heavy in the air. The hired men shifted, their hands brushing the butts of their pistols. Jacob's grip on the axe tightened, but he didn't raise it. He knew one spark here would set fire to everything. "Best leave before dark," Jacob said, his voice low but clear. "Or you'll regret it," Daniel sneered, but he tugged his reins, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't done." His men followed, their silhouettes vanishing against the deepening sky. When silence finally returned, Eliza's breath shuddered free. But peace didn't follow. That night, the house held more fear than warmth. Thomas lingered by the window, watching shadows, while Clara crawled into Eliza's lap, whispering, "Will he take you away?" Eliza stroked her hair, her voice breaking. "Not if I can help it." Later, Jacob sat by the fire, his face drawn, his knife carving slow circles into a block of wood. "He means to press this," he said quietly. "If he stirs the law, we'll fight with our hands." Eliza's chest tightened. "Then I should go." Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "No, that's what he wants. You think leaving will protect these children? Protect you?" Her lips trembled. "I can't be the reason you lose." "Everything." Jacob leaned forward, his voice fierce. "Listen to me. You are not a burden. This house is stronger with you in it. If Warren comes, he'll find out what it means to fight a man with something worth defending." The words wrapped around her like armor, though fear still gnawed at the edges of her heart. The next days proved his warning true. Daniel wasted no time spreading his poison. At the saloon, he spoke of claims and debts. At church, he whispered to neighbors about Jacob's folly. By week's end, a petition had reached the sheriff's desk, a demand to strip Eliza from the Hartley household and return her to her kin. The sheriff rode out himself, his face weary with the burden of judgment. "Jacob," he said, reins slack in his hand. You know I don't hold with Daniel's cruelty. But law's a tricky thing. Widows' rights are as thin as paper. If he presses this, I'll be forced to hear him. Jacob's reply was a quiet growl. You'll hear me too. She chose this home. My children chose her. That counts more than paper. The sheriff sighed, tipping his hat. Just be ready. He won't quit. That night, Jacob gathered the children close by the fire. Listen, he said, his voice steady but heavy. Men might come saying your stepmother doesn't belong here, but she does. More than any of them. You mind me? She's part of this family now. Thomas looked uncertain, his jaw tight. But little Samuel, still pale from his sickness, leaned against Eliza's side. I want her to stay, he whispered. She sat up when no one else would. Eliza's eyes filled, her hand trembling as she touched the boy's hair. For the first time, Thomas's scowl wavered. He glanced between his father and Eliza, and though he said nothing, the fire in his glare softened. Outside, the night pressed, close, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Daniel Warren's threats were no longer just words. They were tightening like a noose. And within the Hartley household, love was beginning to take root, fragile but fierce, ready to fight. For survival. The knock on the door sounded more like a warning than a greeting. It came late in the evening when the fire had burned low and the children were already drowsing. Jacob rose from his chair, his boots heavy on the wood floor. Eliza felt her stomach twist before the latch even lifted. She knew who it would be. Sheriff McCade stood in the doorway, hat in hand, face grim. Behind him, the last light of sunset bled across the horizon. Jacob, he began, his tone low. I've had papers put in front of me. Daniel Warren filed a claim saying Eliza belongs to his household. He's arguing that a widow's rights fall to the husband's kin. Eliza's breath hitched. The room tilted, the walls pressing close. Clara clutched her hand tight, sensing the fear in her silence. Jacob's jaw clenched. And you? Do you believe it? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Law's gray in these parts. The territory court might side with him. If he presses it, I'd be bound to enforce. Jacob's eyes burned. Then let him press it. He'll find more than paper standing in his way. The sheriff sighed, glancing toward Eliza. I just came to warn you. He's stirring men, Jacob. Some are already grumbling in town saying you've overstepped. Watch yourself. With that, he tipped his hat and turned back into the dusk. The door shut heavily behind him. Silence filled the room, broken only by Samuel's small cough. Eliza pressed a hand to her chest, fighting to steady her breath. He'll win, Jacob, she whispered. The law will strip me from here. Jacob stepped closer, his voice steady as iron. No, he won't. Not while I draw breath. The children's eyes were wide, frightened, but Jacob's calm steadied them. Go on to bed, he told them gently. Your stepmother and I have talking to do. When the children were gone, Eliza's resolve cracked. I should leave before he comes back with more men. I won't see your house burned because of me. Jacob shook his head. You don't run from wolves. You stand, or they'll hound you forever. His words should have comforted, but fear gnawed at her. She had lived so long believing she was powerless that shame was her only inheritance. Could she truly fight this? The answer came sooner than she expected. 2 nights later, lanterns bobbed in the dark beyond the fence. Horses stamped, men's voices carried low but sharp. Eliza peeked from the window, heart hammering. Daniel Warren stood at the center, a sneer splitting his face. Jacob opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The children crowded behind Eliza, their whispers hushed with terror. Come out, Hartley. Daniel's voice cracked the night. You can't keep what ain't yours. Sheriff's paper or no, I'll take her tonight. Jacob raised the rifle to his shoulder, calm and unflinching. You'll not set foot past this porch, the hired. Men shifted, their pistols gleaming in the lantern glow. Tension coiled thick as a rattler, ready to strike. Eliza's breath came sharp. She clutched Samuel to her chest, and Clara pressed against her side. Thomas, pale but defiant, stood tall, near the window watching his father's every move. "Think you can face us all?" Daniel taunted. "You're one man. I've got 5. Jacob's reply was steady, cold. "Then 5 men will fall before one of mine is taken." The standoff stretched long, the only sound the creak of leather and the crackle of lanterns. Then Daniel's smirk faltered just slightly as he measured Jacob's eyes, steady, unblinking, promising blood if pushed. "Not tonight, then," Daniel spat. "But this ain't over. The law will be mine. And when it is, you'll be the fool standing in its way." He wheeled his horse, his men following, their shadows melting into the dark. The sound of hooves thundered away until silence swallowed the night again. Jacob lowered the rifle but didn't move from the porch for a long while. Inside, Eliza trembled, her arms wrapped tight around Samuel. Clara cried softly, Thomas scowling. At the door, as if he could burn Daniel's face from his memory. When Jacob finally stepped back inside, Eliza rose to meet him, her voice shaking. "He won't stop. He'll come back, with more men or with paper. He'll keep coming until—" Her words broke. Jacob's hand touched her shoulder, grounding her. "Then we'll keep standing. You think I'd give in now, after what you've given this house? After what you've given me?" Her eyes filled. "I've given you nothing but trouble." His hand tightened, his voice fierce. "You've given my children laughter again. You've given me a reason to fight. That's not trouble, Eliza. That's life." For a moment, silence stretched, heavy with all that remained unsaid. The fire cracked softly, throwing light across Jacob's weathered face, and Eliza realized he meant every word. She turned toward the children, their small bodies curled on quilts by the fire, seeking comfort in the warmth. Clara stirred, murmuring drowsily, "Mama?" The single word pierced the quiet. Eliza froze, her breath stolen. Clara, half asleep, had spoken it without thought. Simple, instinctive, true. Eliza's eyes filled as she knelt beside the little girl, brushing her hair back. "I'm here," she whispered. Jacob watched, his heart heavy, but strong. Trouble still darkened their horizon, but in that fragile moment, he knew they had already begun to win. The crowd gathered before the dust had even settled. It was market day in Dry Creek, the square alive with wagons, horses, and townsfolk trading goods. But all talk stilled when Daniel Warren rode in with a folded paper in his fist and anger, burning in his eyes. Behind him trailed the same rough men who had stood outside Jacob's ranch, their smirks daring trouble. Daniel dismounted in the center of the square, slapping the paper against his palm. "I've got law on my side now," he shouted, his voice carrying across the open air. "This says Eliza Warren belongs to my household. She's no wife to Hartley, no mother to his brats. She's coming with me today." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Women clutched children closer. Men shook their heads, waiting to see how it would unfold. Eliza stood frozen by the wagon, where she had been laying out eggs and bread, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jacob was beside her in an instant, stepping between her and Daniel, his frame broad, his voice steady. "She chose this home. No paper makes her yours. Not now, not ever," Daniel sneered, waving the paper. "Court clerk stamped it. Sheriff can't say otherwise. You defy it. You defy the law." Sheriff McCade, caught in the tide, pushed through the crowd. His face was tight with strain. "I warned you both. The law's cloudy, but this paper's real. Still." His eyes cut toward Daniel. "That doesn't give you the right to drag a woman by force." But Daniel wasn't listening. His hand dropped to his pistol. "Step aside, Hartley, or I'll do more than talk." Gasps rose as men reached for their own weapons, women pulling children back from the square. Eliza's legs trembled, her mind flashing to every cruel word ever hurled at her. This was it, the final blow, the moment shame would consume her again. Then Jacob's voice rang out, louder than the chaos, steady as a mountain. "You all know me," he called, sweeping his gaze across the crowd. "You know what I've worked for, what I've bled for on that land. And you've seen what she's done since she came. When my boy was near death, she kept him alive. When my home sagged with grief, she brought it back to standing. My children, call her Mama, and I'll not let any man, kin or law, take that from us." The square held its breath. Daniel snarled, his pistol clearing leather. But Jacob was faster, his rifle raised, barrel leveled steady. "Don't," Jacob said, his voice low but carrying. "You cross this line, Warren, and you'll not walk away." The tension stretched to breaking. Then Clara's voice, small but fierce, pierced the silence. She had slipped from Eliza's side, her doll clutched to her chest. "She is our mama," she cried, her voice echoing across the square. "And we won't let you take her." The words cut sharper than any weapon. Murmurs swept through the crowd, shifting, rising. Women nodded, eyes fierce. A rancher in the back called, "Hartley's right, she belongs with them." Another chimed in, "Ain't law enough to tear family apart." The tide turned before Daniel's eyes. His smirk faltered as the crowd pressed against him, not with fists, but with judgment. No one reached for his side. No one stood with him. The sheriff's hand hovered near his pistol, his voice hard now. "Put it away, Warren. You're outnumbered. And you've lost." Daniel's eyes darted, fury blazing. For a moment, Eliza feared he'd fire anyway, but the weight of the town bore down, and at last he cursed, shoving his pistol back into its holster. He crumpled the paper in his fist and spat at the ground. "You'll regret this, Hartley," he hissed. Then he swung into the saddle, his men scrambling after him. Hooves thundered as they fled, dust clouding the square. When silence fell again, all eyes turned to Jacob and Eliza. Jacob lowered his rifle, steady hands betraying none of the storm inside. Eliza, trembling, felt Clara slip her small hand into hers. Samuel leaned close, Thomas at her side, his expression finally softened. Less defiance, more acceptance. Jacob looked at her, his voice quiet now, but carrying the same strength. "You're ours. No man can change that." The sheriff gave a weary nod. "Law may be gray, but hearts ain't. Far as Dry Creek's concerned, you belong right where you are." Tears blurred Eliza's vision, but they were not the bitter kind. For the first time, she stood not as cast off, not as barren, not as less. She stood as part of something unshakable, bound not by blood, but by love and choice. The crowd slowly dispersed, but whispers followed. Different now. Admiration, respect, perhaps even wonder. By the time Jacob led her back to the wagon, Eliza knew her life had changed again, not through shame, but through courage. And though Daniel Warren's threats might echo, they would never again hold power over her. The quiet after the storm felt heavier than the storm itself. Back at the ranch, the children crowded close around Eliza as though afraid she might vanish if they let go. Samuel clung to her skirt, Clara nestled against her side, and even Thomas hovered near, his guarded eyes softer now. The square's chaos still rang in their ears, but here, under the roof they all shared, peace was beginning to return. Jacob set his rifle back on its rack and let out a long breath. His shoulders sagged for the first time in days. The burden of defending not just land, but the woman beside him, finally eased. Eliza busied herself with supper, her hands trembling as she stirred the pot. She was not used to the quiet that wasn't empty. This silence carried warmth, belonging. When Jacob stepped beside her, brushing his sleeve against hers, she startled. "You held yourself strong today," he said. Her throat tightened. "I thought my shame would swallow us all. But instead, she glanced toward the children, laughter spilling from Clara as Samuel tried to snatch her doll. They chose me. Jacob's gaze lingered on her profile, the firelight catching the sheen of unshed tears. They didn't just choose you, Eliza. I did. The words struck deep. She turned to meet his eyes, steady as the land he worked. For the first time since her exile, she believed she was no one's burden. She was someone's answer. The days that followed stitched the household into something new. Thomas, though still guarded, began asking her advice when mending tack. Samuel, no longer fevered, sought her lap when storms rattled the windows. Clara, boldest of all, called her Mama openly now, the word falling sweet as honey. Eliza, once discarded, found her worth not in the womb others had condemned, but in the steady rhythm of family life, kneading bread, tending quilts, listening to small voices whispering secrets by firelight. Jacob noticed. Every evening, he saw it. More plainly, how the children's shoulders eased around her, how the house seemed brighter for her presence. And in quiet moments, when the children slept, his heart reached toward hers with a pull he could no longer ignore. One such night, as the fire dwindled to embers, Jacob set aside his whittling and spoke. Eliza, when I stood in that square, today I knew something sure. You're not just holding this house together. You're part of it. Part of me. Her breath caught, her heart pounding. Jacob! He reached for her hand, rough palm against hers, warm and steady. I won't pretend I ain't still grieving. But grief doesn't close the door on love. It just makes us see it clearer when it comes again. And love's here now because of you. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks. She had been sold as useless, cast aside as barren. Yet here, in the heart of this ranch, a widowed man and his children had chosen her. And in their choice, she had found herself again. I never thought I'd be wanted, she whispered. You're more than wanted, Jacob said. His thumb brushed her knuckles. You're needed, by them, by me. Spring came, softening the hard edges of winter. The ranch hummed with life again, fields tilled, fences mended, children's laughter ringing across the yard. And at the center stood Eliza, apron dusted with flour, hair lit by morning sun, no longer shadowed by shame. On a quiet Sunday morning, Clara tugged Jacob's sleeve in front of the congregation, her voice bright as a bell. Papa, when are you going to marry Mama proper? The church burst with chuckles, and Jacob's ears reddened, but he didn't flinch. He glanced at Eliza, her cheeks burning, her hands trembling at her sides. Then he spoke, voice steady and clear enough for every ear to hear. Soon, he said, because she's already been our family longer than any paper could prove. The congregation murmured approval. Even those who had once gossiped now nodded with respect. Eliza's tears fell freely, but they were not bitter. They were born of love, the kind chosen, not forced, built, not broken. By summer's height, the Hartley Ranch bore the look of a place reborn. Where once sorrow had lingered, joy now bloomed. Where once a woman thought herself useless, she now stood as the heart of a home. And when Clara's voice rang across the yard, calling, "Mama, come quick!" Eliza ran, not with dread, but with laughter, for she knew at last. Family was not measured in children born, but in love given and received. They said she was useless, barren, a woman meant to vanish in shame. But the frontier has its own way of telling the truth. A widowed rancher's children called her Mama, and in that word, she found her worth. This was not just survival, it was redemption, the kind only love can carve out of hardship. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, about families made by choice, about courage found in the unlikeliest places, then stay with us. Subscribe, share, and ride along for more tales of the frontier where hope is always waiting at the horizon.